Thank you, everybody, for coming today. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the Center for Cape Breton Studies lecture series. This is the fourth installment, and I'm here to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Fred Burrill, who I met some years ago now when he was completing his first project, which explored the neighborhood of Saint-Henri in the city of Montreal. And in Fred's dissertation, he traces the sort of process of gentrification and displacement experienced by residents of that neighborhood along the processes of deindustrialization and change in the urban landscape of Montreal. Since that time, Fred has taken up a postdoctoral posting here at the Center for Cape Breton Studies, where he is working on topics related to memories of death and dying in post-industrial and deindustrializing places, with a particular focus on his own neck of the woods, the Musquodoboit Valley in Nova Scotia. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Fred Burrill.
Thanks, Lachlan. Well, thank you, Lachlan. As Lachlan says, my name's Fred. I grew up in the central mainland in the Musquodoboit Valley. I'm a postdoctoral researcher here at CBU, and I'm a part, along with Lachlan, of this transnational partnership called Deindustrialization and the Politics of Our Time, which brings together researchers from Canada and the US, the UK, Germany, Italy, France, and a few other countries to boot, looking at deindustrialization as the sort of great historical process of the second half of the 20th century that transformed industrial working class communities, like here in Sydney, but also like where I grew up in Upper Musquodoboit, which, as you can see, is here where I've circled in the red, which is kind of in the center of the mainland, on the kind of the off the main drag between Truro and Halifax. I grew up in a village called Upper Musquodoboit, which had about 400 people at the time. It has a few less than that now. But I spent the last 20 years living in Montreal, working as a community organizer, and then coming back to do my PhD, oral histories of working class tenant organizing in the southwest of the city. But I'm sort of gradually doing a kind of a reorientation towards the place where I grew up, which has always, been in my mind, particularly around the issues of death and dying. And so I'm working on this project now that I'm calling Yea Though I Walk, Death and Dying in the Musquodoboit Valley. So the Musquodoboit Valley, like many places in the Maritimes and Atlantic Canada as a whole, has been subject to these kind of brutal waves of industrialization and deindustrialization in the boom and bust resource economy. And this includes the gold booms of the late 19th century, early 20th century, and then again in the 1930s. And when I was growing up there in the 1990s, having the largest sawmill in Eastern Canada, which was a company called Macterra, which went belly up in the lead up to the 2008 financial crisis. People of my generation have largely been dispersed across the country and the world. In fact, working in the tar sands, working up north, flying back and forth, or patrolling occupied territory in Kandahar. Now there's this kind of short-lived reinvestment in the area through open pit gold mining of an Australian company called St. Barbara, which I'll get to. So I'm looking particularly at what I'm calling the contradictions of working class life through the cultural and social lens of death and dying, which I know growing up in the Musquodoboit Valley as the son of the rural United Church minister, kind of structures the everyday in a way that I think is particular of maritime working class life. So questions of who is ill, who died, who's in the hospital, who they're related to, where they worked, structure almost every conversation. If you read if you read, here in the Cape Breton Post, or if you read in the Chronicle Herald, you go through the obituaries, which of course everybody does. That's the first thing they do when they get the newspaper. That and the funny pages. You see something that's very particular in which it'll say, such and such passed away at this time, and it'll usually give a reason or a cause of death, and then it says, he was a hard worker. He worked here, 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 and here. And then it says where you can give donations, But if you read obituaries in the Globe and Mail or in Montreal, in the Devoir, for example, it's only sort of the scions of society, right, who get their obituary in the paper, and it talks about their sort of charitable endeavors and what they were interested in, what kind of books they like to read. So there's something about death culture, which is in the Maritimes, which I think is foundationally tied up with working class life. And so using oral history, I'm studying what I'm calling 3 microhistories of death and dying. So the first one, the picture on the top left, is a softball field in the middle of the woods, in a little place called Pleasant Valley. And I'm studying kind of community softball memorial tournaments that commemorate the lives of 2 young men who were lost to vehicular accidents. One in the 1970s, who actually in the construction of the field fell off the back of a truck and died. And one who was a person who I went to high school with, who was killed in a car accident in Fort McMurray, where he had been working. And I think that the difference between these 2 moments, the softball tournament in the 1970s is fast-pitch softball. It's super competitive. There's people who come from the little communities all around. Its 21st century version is kind of lob ball. It's people from the village. And I think this is indicative of the impact of neoliberal restructuring and out-migration on the kind of the coherence and integrity of community life. The second story that I'm studying is that of the mostly women and elderly volunteers and employees of the Arimathea Funeral Cooperative, which is one of 2 funeral co-ops here in Nova Scotia, the other one here in Cape Breton in the Margaree Valley. Which provides at cost funeral and burial services to people in the Musquodoboit Valley and around the central mainland, pushing back against the kind of the predatory practices of the multinational funeral industry, which I think is a kind of an interesting example of community organizing in the lack of sort of the formal labor structures of unions in a place that like Cape Breton, for example. And I'll get to that again at the end about this distinction between the presence or absence of organized labor. And the final story that I'm studying, and the one I'm going to talk about today, is that of the 1936 Moose River mine cave-in, which was in a little place which basically doesn't exist anymore, but which was a highly, highly mediatized event, and there are kind of contrasting memories about this in the community and at large. So, the cave-in itself is a kind of an interesting story and fits in a particular place in the history of mining disasters in Nova Scotia, in that it was only 3 people who were trapped underground. Unlike Spring Hill or Westray or some of the many cave-ins here in Cape Breton, but occupied a place that was basically totally out of proportion to the scale of the disaster in the media landscape. So Nova Scotia in the late 19th century and the first half of the 20th experienced several short intensive waves of investment in gold mining. The last of these began in the Great Depression with the collapse of currency markets and stocks and commodity prices. And many dormant mines from earlier cycles, like that in Moose River, which had been first operated in the 1890s, were opened up again, often with little regard for safety. So one of these was that in the community of Moose River Gold Mines, which is off of the main road. I actually spent a lot of time there as a teenager because I worked on a Christmas tree farm, which was up behind where the mine had been. But at the time, it had about 40 families. So when I was there, there was almost no one who lived there, to a few houses. But at the time, it had about 40 families. So there was a consortium of investors, mostly from Toronto, who formed a company called the Nova Scotia Gold Mining Syndicate, and started draining water from the old shafts in January 1936. Crucially, the Department of Mines was not informed that the mine was in operation again, and so there was no inspection, which if there had have been, they would have realized that the practices of the company were completely unsafe. They were removing timbers as they went to get at the easy gold out of the old stopes. So on Easter Sunday in April 1936, two of the syndicate's main Toronto-based investors, one a young lawyer named Herman McGill, and the other Dr. David Robertson. In the picture you can see Dr. Robertson emerging from the pit where he had been rescued. And Dr. Robertson was a surgeon and the chief of staff at the Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto, went into the mine on an inspection tour, almost in the middle of the night, actually, with the company's timekeeper, who was a man named Alfred Scatting. There was an almost immediate collapse of the shaft that they were in, followed by 9 days of frantic rescue efforts by miners from across the province and as far away as Ontario. Eventually, Robertson and Scatting were saved, but unfortunately Herman McGill didn't survive the ordeal. The story recounted by the hordes of media who descended on the disaster site was that the rescue was principally made possible through the efforts of a crew of Stellarton dragermen, or mine rescue workers, led by a Spring Hill coal miner named Billy Bell, who was at the time the province's official diamond driller. But by 1936, there were already more than 1,600 miners in Nova Scotia who had lost their lives underground. The coverage of this particular cave-in was denounced by a guy named John Mortimer, who was a kind of a progressive social critic and United Church minister, as Moose River madness. He said it was justified by the class backgrounds of the men trapped underground, and in fact, the fact that they were from Ontario, and there were dozens and dozens of journalists. There were live reporting from the site. Angus L. MacDonald went to the site, the Premier of Nova Scotia at the time, in a type of frenzy that was not present for those working class men in the coal industry who were trapped often underground. And because probably of these class reasons, it was the first event in Canadian history, and in fact of its kind in the world actually, that was live broadcast over the radio by a guy named J. Frank Willis of the nascent, what was at the time called the Canadian Radio Broadcasting Corporation. And the events of the rescue, the live cast of the rescue, were broadcast on the radio to over 160 million listeners across North America, as well as through the BBC to the UK. And then actually King George was listening and sent a letter afterwards saying, I'm glad the men were rescued and please keep me updated on the situation. So, this tiny little place became sort of central for a little bit in kind of the public mind's eye of what it meant to be a miner and the dangers of mining, even though the fact that the men who had went underground were not miners at all. I just want to play for you a little clip of J. Frank Willis, just to get a sense of what people were listening to. Thanks, Chris.
Herman McGill Dixon and Albert Scatting of Toronto, Ontario, are still in the depths of Moose River mines late this afternoon. They can hang on for 8 or 10 hours more, but that won't be necessary, we don't think. The latest word sent up through the pipeline, which has been sunk into the pit by a diamond drill, brings word from the men below that they can hear tapping. They can hear the men in the workings breaking down the rock to get through to them.
So you get an example of the kind of the dramatic flair of someone named like J. Frank Willis, who in fact, you know, this kind of radio broadcast journalism didn't exist at this time. So actually he had a kind of a background in theater. So you could see the kind of the construction in the mind's eye of the events of Moose River. In the years that followed, almost immediately, the events or sort of stylized versions of them were immortalized in a 1937 B Hollywood movie called Dragoman Courage, which you can see the kind of the trailer of online. It's quite something, and of course in Wilf Carter's famous song, "The Rescue at Moose River Gold Mines," and Wilf Carter being from Nova Scotia, but was kind of one of the first along the Hank Williams generation of the kind of the cowboy tradition in the progenitor of American country music, who heard the events on the radio and wrote this song. So events of this sort become often sort of deeply entrenched in local memory and identity. Part of a regional pattern here in Atlantic Canada, as you know, your colleague Heather Sparling has talked about, of an overlap between the kind of the vibrant cultural production of the Maritimes and a preponderance of high-risk industries. By contrast, I have always found the place of the Moose River Cave-In in popular memory in the Musquodoboit Valley to be curiously muted. So when I was growing up there in the 1990s, there was this sort of modest little museum, which was in the old schoolhouse in the community, staffed by summer high school students working under the kind of the faltering local Musquodoboit Valley Tourism Association. And community members would gather in the old Moose River United Church, which of course had been non-functioning as a place of worship for close to 50 years at that point. And life in the village was remembered by older people who had lived there as children, but who had moved away. And you can see the example of History of Moose River Gold Mines, which is written by the grandfather of a good friend of mine from high school who had actually moved away to Massachusetts, where he had grown up as a teenager, but who had lived in Moose River as a child. And if we go back to the first slide, there's a little kind of cairn there or there was, at the site of the mine with a piece of pipe sticking out, which was the tube through which they had communicated with the men trapped underground. But very, very, very modest, off the beaten track. You know, it was not, in fact, a site of tourism or attraction. But simultaneously, I realize now, as I'm getting into this research, that there were sort of interesting subterranean things going on. One, I think, is that the muted nature of the memorialization is perhaps partially due to how much the sensationalized media coverage of the events at the time passed over the presence of Musquodoboit miners in the story. You know, so the emphasis was on Billy Bell, it was on the miners from Stellarton. And in fact, my own family history kind of crosses over with this, because at the time, one of the doctors on site, or the main doctor on site, was a guy named Dr. Sutherland, who was my great-great-uncle, who in the kind of, actually curiously afterward, there were publications in major Canadian medical journals about the effects of deprivation. They had studied basically the health condition of the two men who were rescued. And Dr. Sutherland was completely written out of the story, but in local history, it was Dr. Sutherland who was the doctor present. So my own dad, Gary Burrill, in collaboration with one of these summer students, a woman named Jeanette Perrin, who actually was one of my elementary school teachers later on, recorded interviews in the mid-1990s with the last remaining local rescue workers in the lead up to the 60th anniversary, so in 1996. It's published in the regional magazine New Maritimes in 1996, October of 1996. These interviews really pointed out some of these dynamics of erasure. And one crucial thing that came up was that the local miners had been warning ownership for weeks of the imminent danger in the lead up to the cave-in. So the coverage at the time was very much this was completely, this was completely a surprise that these men would never have gone underground if they thought that was going to happen. And in fact, it was suggested in some cases that they had not been given sufficient kind of information by the miners who worked there. So Gerald Logan, who has now passed away, but who lived down the road from me when I was growing up, and who was from another nearby community named Caribou, where there was also a gold mine, and who knew this kind of successive wave of outside investors coming in, said every once in a while here in Nova Scotia, somebody will come along with another idea about how you can make money of an old gold mine. And they'll go down and dewater it and start working it again. That's what happened there. Moose River had opened up. But what they were doing was they were taking out the pillars that were left in, and that is just like taking the corner out of your house. They were taking them out in order to get the easy gold that was left by the old miners years ago, so when the mine was opened in the 1890s. But it was getting very, very dangerous to continue mining into it. You get blasting and not leaving enough pillars, it gets weak after a while and gradually gives out on you. And it came to the stage where the miners decided it was time to close it down. They'd stoped it all out. So the stope, I've learned in this process, that those of you who know infinitely more about mining than me know that it's the kind of, it's the open space that is supported by the surrounding rock that is dug out when in the process of mining, that normally is supported by pillars, but they were pulling the pillars out. They'd stoped it all out, or pretty well stoped it all out, and that's when the old miners that were in there said, "Get out of it, boys, it's time to clear it out." So secondly, without taking away from the importance of the Stellarton crew, the interviews revealed that, in fact, that 45 of the rescuers were from this nearby small community of Caribou Gold Mines, where they were working for a similar operation being run by a company called Consolidated Mining and Smelting. It was, in fact, two of these miners, one of them who was my next-door neighbor as a kid, Lou Logan, and his friend Stan Brown, who first realized that the men trapped below were still alive when they saw wisps of smoke coming up out of the ground. So this is, in fact, a story of out-migration and how it generates working-class knowledge, because Lou and Stan, who, like many of their generation in the 1920s and early 30s in the Maritimes, had gone to work further west, had spent time as teenagers and young men working in the mines of Noranda in Quebec. And from that experience knew that men who were in the cold of an open stope would sometimes burn the empty powder boxes that were used to blast out, in that case, in Noranda, gold and aluminum, I think, to stay warm and recognize the smell. Similarly, Lou was assigned to the diamond drill when first contact was made with the trapped men, and heard the distinctive tap, tap, tap sound. He told us, children gathered at the 60th anniversary event in 1996, "Oh, you can't imagine what a feeling it was to hear that sound." And he described participating in the rescue as one of the greatest events of his life. Lou was also a World War II veteran and lost his brother in the fighting in France, and so knew a little bit about dramatic events. So I think there was a certain kind of defiance in these memories. Nate Higgins remembered, "I thought we did as much as any of them, but we didn't get too much praise for it there in Moose River. They don't like us to say anything, but we were there and we did a lot." It's interesting because John Mortimer, in his article in 1936, in which he denounced Moose River madness, this article was republished by New Maritimes in 1986, and it was a preface was written by David Frank, and David Frank pointed out that in fact it was probably no coincidence that so much attention was put on the Stellarton miners, as this boosted the profits of the mining company in Stellarton. But of the most interest to me in all of this, going through these transcripts of these interviews that were done in the 90s, is something I came across, something that my dad and Jeanette Perrin, now Jeanette Higgins, decided to leave out of the story. So Herman McGill, who was the young Toronto lawyer who died underground, was said at the time to have succumbed to the elements or died of exposure. And the coroner indicated that he died from pneumonia. One of the interviewees, however, had a different idea, although in the space of the interview, it reads as being almost sort of uncommunicable. So my dad was, kind of learning about this at the time. This is not long after we had moved there in 1990. Said, was McGill injured? Is that how he died, from injuries? And the interviewee said, I know what happened, but they never mentioned it. And so the interviewer said, is it better not to mention it? And the man indicated, I don't think it's very good. And then there's just a simple note in the transcript, which says, nods suicide, with the tape off. So when I came across this, I asked my dad, what is this? I've never heard anything that Herman McGill took his own life underground, even though he had been described by Dr. Robertson as a sort of a high-strung individual. And when you read the accounts, maybe you can sort of see something between the lines that he had not been able to stand up to the rigors of being trapped underground. And so, I asked my dad about this, and he agreed that I could probably share what I found in the transcript, given that both the interviewee and Herman McGill have long since passed away. But the details of what was discussed with the tape off are another question. That was a confidential conversation. But that leaves me to wonder, who was this interviewee trying to protect? Why would he care about the reputation of this Toronto mine owner who, to my eyes, and perhaps it's an uncharitable reading, but was very clearly the author of his own demise. And so why does this interviewee care about his reputation, care about the feelings of his family? And so it's obviously, left to historians to provide a conjecture. And for me, this interchange speaks volumes about the complicated nature of class relations in rural Nova Scotia. So the Musquodoboit Valley is a place with almost no history of organized labor or unions to speak of, where employer relationships are tied up in these kind of individualized, clientelized, often family-dominated, messy ties. This dynamic came up again in the 1990s when there was an attempt by an international union to organize MacTerra, which of course was, as I mentioned at the beginning, was the largest sawmill in Eastern Canada. And that vote failed for many reasons, but because I think principally there was no actually tradition or culture of labor organizing amongst the rural working class, despite it being a heavily industrialized space and being affected by these cyclical patterns of regional deindustrialization and experiencing all of the same kind of hardships of both labor and its removal of a place like industrial Cape Breton, but without the same kind of collective capacity. We see there is defiance in these interviews, but there is also a kind of a respect for the company ownership, even though the company ownership were basically these kind of professional lawyer doctor types in Toronto who had very little idea about mining, who just kind of got excited about making some fast money, employed a bunch of local people, did it in an irresponsible way and lost their lives because of it. But the appreciation of the situation was more complicated than that for the men who had gone through it, for, I think, these dynamics of rural working class life. And so now, there are kind of new gold booms happening, new forms of death in the Moose River context. So here you can see kind of an aerial view of the open pit mine, which is called the Tokoi gold mine, which was opened maybe 4 or 5 years ago by a company at the time, which was called Atlantic Gold. Now it's been purchased by this larger multinational corporation, but based in Australia, named St. Barbara. So of course, those of you who follow the gold industry know that it is the former settler colonies of the British Empire which predominate massively in the gold industry, and that the pattern is a small company will sort of do the process of social acceptability, get the licenses, buy off people in the area, and then they will begin exploration, and they'll be bought up by a larger multinational. And the way this happens is they come in, they basically blow everything up, pull out the remaining gold, treat it through a process of cyanide, which then poisons the waterways in the surrounding area. They promise jobs, although they don't really come through because it basically depends on a kind of a transient population of workers who go between these major gold mining operations across North America, and indeed across kind of the former settler colonies and their role and their sphere of imperial influence, and then they leave. And so the Tokoi mining operation is basically already shut down. It's in the process of winding down. They've paid, it's a pittance to them, but already over $250,000 in fines in provincial and federal environmental mining violations, environmental violations. And so people in the area are left to kind of deal with, once again, this legacy of death, although in this case it's social death of the community. So where you see that hole is where Moose River was. So in fact, they bought up the few remaining homes there, and in fact expropriated the land through the Nova Scotia mining regulation system, which essentially is set up so that property owners and landowners lose rights to their property if there are traces of gold underneath. The local people are then left to deal with the environmental legacies of this. So my partner is from Quebec, and she had never been to Upper Musquodoboit a couple of years ago. So when I drove her out there, and of course, because it's rural Nova Scotia, I got a flat tire. And of course, because I'm a useless intellectual, I didn't know how to change the tire. So I knocked on the door of a house where I had known the people growing up. In fact, the guy who answered was a mining employee who was living in the house that was being rented by the company. And he didn't have any tools because he wasn't from there. So I went next door, where I also knew the people, and fortunately they were still there. And it was actually a younger guy who now lived in what, when I grew up there, had been his grandmother's house, but who's a few years younger than me. And he came out, and obviously because he lives in rural Nova Scotia, he had all the tools you could possibly need and fixed the car. But in the process told me that he had worked for the drilling and blasting company that blew up this hole in the ground. But that he had decided to stop working for the mine because he was also an avid fisher, sport fisherman. And he could see the impact on the fish population of the tailings from the mine. And in fact, this environmental death, this social death, is also a death of memory because Moose River is gone. It is this massive hole in the ground. And the cairn, which was put up over the site of the mine, and the Mining Museum have both been displaced to the opening of this massive pit. And they get kind of a small amount of subsidy from the company, but it's really unclear what's going to happen once the company pulls up stakes, which it's in the process of doing. So, this is all still obviously quite preliminary, but to me, I think it speaks to the potential advantages of focusing on this process of social death, or social life through death, in fact, as a way to hold the totality and the complexity of rural working class lives that I think are played out in the kind of these often violent swings between industrial resource development and deindustrialization. And for me, obviously, it's a way to kind of reconnect to a place where my family doesn't live anymore, and where I haven't lived for 20 years, but I still, like many Maritimers who have moved west, start my mornings on the internet reading the obituaries. Thanks. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Fred. So now we have time for questions. So if anybody has a question for Fred on his presentation today or other elements of his research that he's described, I'll open the floor for questions. And perhaps I'll ask the first question.
Sure.
In some ways, your story of coming back to this research is that old maritime story of moving west, inhabiting a different space, and then yet having this kind of curiosity about the East in this way, right? Mm-hmm. So when you're doing your own interviews, and I know that you haven't done any related to this particular microhistory, but when you come back and you're doing your own interviews, how is that sort of insider-outsider dynamic how does that play out, or how are you grappling with that?
It's funny, I did, on the softball part, I did actually a bunch of interviews in 2007, which was only 2 years after I'd moved to Montreal, and because even though it was ridiculous to have done it that way, that far into the 21st century, I did them on a cassette because I just didn't know how to do anything. And so recently I was digitalizing these cassettes, and I thought, oh my goodness, I have such a huge accent in the interview. Which my family makes fun of me now for speaking like I'm somebody from Central Canada. Apparently, I don't say car anymore. But I think that dynamic, I'm always super self-conscious about it. Partially because of the way that we moved into that area. I was born in Nova Scotia, but we came there for my dad to be the United Church minister in 1990 when I was 4. And there was this sort of constant insider-outsider dynamic anyway, which is, for those of you who are familiar with the economics of the United Church, that a rural United Church minister occupies a kind of a professional class position, but often makes less money than the people that they're ministering to. And so we occupied this kind of funny class position, which I think prepared me to be in that insider-outsider role as an interviewer. But all the same, it's I'm self-conscious about having moved west and not come back. I have 3 siblings, and they all live in Halifax, within a block or 2 of my parents, and they all see each other several times a week. And that's not part of my life, and that's a sadness to me. But I think it's also has permitted me to kind of.
They all play in a really good band too.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. They're playing with Symphony Nova Scotia next week, actually. Yeah, but they, that. I think that's kind of prepared me to see things from a way that you can't necessarily always see it from the inside as well. Yeah.
Cool.
I do philosophy, and always I was listening to your story from the philosophical side.
Of course.
And the starting point, the middle, and the end. I don't know that is a kind of maybe a suggestion or something that when you started from the concern about this, and people always talking about this of the people, and then in the middle that the Moose River area was a place to live for the local community, and then you ended up with this picture. It reminded me Martin Heidegger.
Uh-huh.
You know, I don't know that you read anything by him.
No, I only know who that is.
Yeah, he's a philosopher that maybe he can have some impressions for you. That why we concerned about this as a human that live in a place, and he conceptualized a lot about the way that people settle in a place and live and find a place their homes, you know, all these philosophical concepts that is different than other creatures that they maybe just randomly select a place and find some resources for food, for settlement, and then we as a humans, we make an area our home. That therefore Moose River, for the people that they live there, is their home, that they care about any aspect, any natural element of that area. And this is their home. This is the only way that, one of the difference that the humans live compared to the other creatures. And then he has a letter concerning technology, that why by technology we destroy this home and we destroy all these minings, and he talks about minings and some factories beside rivers, that when a river is a place that is our home, but the new technology comes to the river and reshape the meaning of the river for us. He has a short treatise question concerning technology.
Okay.
That could be always, even when you were talking,
You're thinking about Heidegger.
Reminding me Heidegger. Maybe if you
Absolutely.
just by chance read some pieces by him, he gives some impressions to you.
I mean, it would probably be good for my general education as a whole, but I would be interested to look into that. Thank you. I mean, it makes me think about this concept of domicide. That I've been, I'm teaching history of race and gender in Canada this semester. So I'm teaching my students about internment and dispossession of Japanese Canadians in World War II. And so one of the concepts that scholars are working with is domicide, which is the killing of the home. And actually, Nova Scotia's legislation around subsurface mineral rights is designed to carry out domicide, such that those who own their homes or who own a business on the surface, if a company stakes a claim to the mineral rights underneath, there's nothing that the homeowner can do about that. And in fact, the family that I worked for, the Christmas tree farm business, who had multiple generations associated with Moose River, took Atlantic Gold to court to multiple levels, I think up to the Supreme Court in Nova Scotia, to contest the expropriation of their land, which would have blocked the process as a whole. But the NDP government at the time, despite the opposition of the family and of the local MLA, who was my dad at the time, passed it through because they were not wanting to seem anti-business. But of course, anti-business would have been probably good in this context, right? Because the company has made untold millions of dollars off of this massive hole in the ground. There are a couple dozen jobs generated for 3 or 4 years, and the water is poisoned all around. So yeah, thank you. That's interesting.
I love that notion, Fred, of the alienation of subsurface stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, that goes back to the early 19th century,
Yeah.
you know, and the crown taking control over those kinds of things, which passes through a whole number of things in the 19th century.
Yeah.
So really you're seeing sort of final iteration of it when you see something like this.
Totally. I mean, it's fundamental to the nature of settler colonialism, right? In Canada, and that's why we see it's similar in places like Australia and New Zealand and the U.S. because they've all generated this body of laws oriented around the kind of the primacy of the extraction of minerals. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
It also strikes me, especially in that slide that you had about the country music, right? In fact, in another earlier iteration of this lecture series, we heard somebody present on the connection between Appalachian industrial culture and country music and bluegrass music and other sorts of like iterations of that. That was one of the last lectures we heard.
Oh yeah.
And it strikes me that there is this sort of sound landscape that's connected to this, right? Both radio and then music. I was wondering if you could maybe talk. I don't exactly know how to articulate the question, but it just strikes me that there is this interesting kind of aspect of this Moose River story that's connected in that way.
Absolutely. So, I mean, the expert on this is Heather Sparling, right? Who has written in her book about disaster songs in Atlantic Canada, has a whole section on this Wilf Carter song, in which she writes this doesn't fall into the Moose River doesn't fall into the kind of scientifically agreed upon consensus of what constitutes a disaster socially, but in fact, became refracted through this lens because of the particular moment in the development of disaster songs in the kind of country music industry. And so, it's really interesting to think about like Wilf Carter, Hank Snow, these rural working class Nova Scotian guys, right, who become the progenitors of American country music. Wilf Carter's musician name, I think, was Tennessee Slim, if I'm remembering correctly. He's living in Nashville, he's recording this music, and but in fact, it comes out of not only the Appalachian tradition, but in fact the industrial working class and indeed rural working class tradition of Nova Scotia. And it's super interesting. I remember in the 1996 anniversary event, a guy from the community sang. There's like an extended version of the Wilf Carter song. It follows a certain pattern, as Dr. Sparling points out. It names the victims, it names the number of victims, it names the nature of it. So there's a kind of a rhetorical form to these songs. And he did like the entire rendition. Like it went on for a really long time from memory. But it's interesting to think about the ways that local experiences are then kind of refracted up to the level of mass popular culture and then re-internalized, even though the mass popular culture of the song was part of the writing out of the local experience in the 1930s. So there are these multiple levels of capitalist cultural production going on that are actually internalized and repurposed in really authentic ways by local working class populations. Yeah.
Any other questions?
It's a question that, pertains in a general sense to what you've been talking about today, but is a little bit different in the sense, I'm speaking from the experience of coal mining and coal mining communities. And what I'm kind of curious about is the way in which sort of rural migrants to mining towns are socialized or acculturated into that work experience, and then also politicized. Probably it's too small a group for you to be thinking about it in that kind of context, but I mean this rural kind of to urban community is, I think, very, very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think part of the difference between the experience of a place like industrial Cape Breton and the Musquodoboit Valley is that the bringing together of the population, which forms a class, is always temporary. So, you know, the mine will open, it'll operate for 5 years, it'll employ somewhere between 25 and 50 people, and then it closes, right? And people go on to other forms of employment. Or, you know, they'll go like my neighbor Lou Logan, they'll go and they'll work in Noranda for a couple of years, and then they'll be back in Nova Scotia, and they'll be, you know, they'll be doing a little bit of woods work, they'll be doing a little bit of farming, they'll be doing a little bit of mining, but there's never this kind of like permanent identification with one form of employment. And I think this is actually pretty similar to the contemporary experience, or at least of people of my generation, you know, going to work in the tar sands and then coming home for a bit, and then going to work up in northern BC for a while, and then coming home for a bit. So the politicization is certainly there, but it's not in this kind of, it's not a collective politicization, even though it's a collective experience. I mean, that's been my experience of the interviews that I've done. Yeah.
I was thinking in terms of the coal miners,
Yeah.
the extent to which they become unionized.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But they're permanent.
Yeah.
You know, once they migrate from rural areas, they very
Absolutely.
seldom sort of return.
Yeah, yeah, and it makes all the difference, that union structure, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Just as a little tip, I've been looking at very recently the Canadian manuscript census for 1931, which
Okay.
was just released a little while ago.
Okay.
I didn't sort of think of going to look at Moose River, but I urge you to go and take a look at it.
Yeah, I will definitely do
Because it's got every individual in the community and all sorts of occupational and land ownership, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh, wow, that's fascinating. Yeah, I definitely will, thank you.
And it's unbelievable.
I mean, that's a precious resource. What I've
Just before your incident.
Absolutely. I've been working from local memories of who lived in what house, so that will be super helpful.
Yeah, they actually name the houses.
Oh, wow.
Or a number of them.
Okay.
In some way. And the instructions to the census taker is to go to house to house to house.
Right,
so
right, right.
if you know where you're starting, you can figure
Yeah,
it
yeah, then you can figure it out. Yeah.
out. And in rural areas, it's quite stunning. I mean, I've been doing some stuff with people in Marguerite.
Okay.
And you'll find names that you know, and then you can sort of work
Absolutely.
away from that.
Oh, that's great, because I've got like a hand-drawn map, you know, from memory of who lived in what house, but that'll definitely be helpful. Thank you, Dale. Yeah.
It's available online.
Wow.
Well, we perhaps have time for one final question, if anybody has a last burning question for Fred. And not seeing any hands shoot up, Fred, I think I'll ask everybody to once again thank Dr. Burrill for his presentation today, and thank you everyone for coming to the center for his presentation.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks very much for the invitation. Yeah.